In Australia specifically, the indie scene's really interesting. There's always been some indie developers in Australia, but now there's just been an absolute explosion of indies, and it's really because a lot of the larger studios who were traditionally doing work for hire have gone under. Out of the ashes of all of those studios, we have these really passionate, like, you know, 1, 2, 3-man teams starting up, and all of a sudden there's just an explosion of indies and some incredibly interesting and creative and brilliant games coming out of Australia at the moment. If you're an indie developer, then you can probably not imagine yourself doing anything other than making games, and that's definitely how a lot of people at Halfbrick are. And you know, our teams inside Halfbrick are actually really small. So even though we're one large company, we have, you know, these small little 6-man teams which are kind of almost like their own indie developers inside of Halfbrick. We had a process at Halfbrick called Halfbrick Fridays. So the idea was every second Friday, everyone could work on basically whatever they wanted. And there was just this crazy amount of incredible and bizarre ideas getting produced. Some of those games that were really starting to rise to the top, we really noticed that these were standouts. So we looked at releasing those on Xbox Live Indie Games, which was our first foray into making original IP. Although the games were good, that was a disaster. So after that, we were looking at the PSP Minis. We'd previously developed a PSP game before, and PSP Minis kind of looked like it was going to be the next big thing. That's sort of how it looked to us. So we looked at moving some of our Xbox Live indie games over to PSP Minis. We did a lot of work on them, a lot of improvements, and made them much better games, and that was another massive failure. That was just the next kind of disaster. And then sometime after that, we started looking at iPhone, and that's when we finally sort of found success with Fruit Ninja. I think developing your own IP is always going to be a big risk, but that's where the big reward is as well. And I think for most game developers, developing new IP is really what they want to be doing, because, you know, that's what's exciting. If you can get original IP off the ground and have that working for you, that's always going to be the most stable way to kind of build a career in games, because if you're doing contract work, you're always at the whim of somebody else's wants. The one piece of advice I always give is make games. Make lots and lots and lots of games. Every game you make, you'll learn something. So don't go and make one game that's going to take you 3 years to make, because you'll spend 3 years learning 3 or 4 very hard lessons. People will come to us applying for a job and they've only ever made kind of 1 or 2 things, and there will have been big things that they've spent quite a few years on. But the guys who have made lots and lots of small games have learnt so many more lessons through the process of doing that. Test the game a lot. Test it on everyone. Don't just test it on people who make games, because they've been playing games forever. Take it home and get your partner to test it, get kids to test it, get your grandmother to test it, get random people on the street to test it. The more people you get to play the game, the more insight you're going to have into, you know, how it works and how people perceive it and what needs to be improved. I can't think of any other more kind of universal rule for making games than that. It's just test, 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 test. You know, in terms of getting your game exposure, if you've already made the game and it's finished and you're just starting to think about exposure now, it's already too late. You should really be thinking about exposure from day one. You should be part of the design of the game. You should be thinking about why would people want to play this and what would they tell their friends about if they're describing this game. Is there a language that they can use to describe the game and describe the object of the game? And yeah, it really needs to be something that you're doing from day one. If you do that from day one, when you get to the day that the game is finished and it's time to start thinking about marketing, it'll all come very naturally, because you've already built all of the tools and the hooks into the game right from the beginning.
I feel the indie scene is where creators can actually really create.